Okay, good afternoon, everybody. I welcome you all on this important online side event that is going to be focused on digital rights in Saudi Arabia. Before I just give you an introduction to this topic, let me just introduce our distinguished speakers. We have with us human rights activist Arij Al-Sadhan. She is a human rights activist trying her best to defend human rights, including digital rights in Saudi Arabia. Also, she is working hard to defend the rights of detainees in Saudi Arabia, including online activists. One of them is her brother, Abdulrahman Al-Sadhan. He is in prison since 2018. She will talk about the case of her brother, and also in general, she's going to talk about violations of digital rights in Saudi Arabia. And then we have our colleague, Abdel Aziz Al-Muayyad. He's working to establish the human rights unit at the Diaspora Party, Saudi Party. And as you know, this party is not an ideological party, but a party that has a lot of concern about human rights violations in Saudi Arabia. And then we have my colleague, Salwa Al-Ghazwani. She is the head of MENA desk at Article 19. Salwa is heavily involved in defending the rights of journalists and defending the rights of those who are defending freedom of expression across the MENA region. And also, for sure, she is working to defend the digital rights across the region. And then I have my colleague, Marwa Fatata. She is really well known for her work in many organizations. And finally, now she is working as a director of policy for MENA region at Access Now. Access Now is well known for their work, heavy work on digital rights. And now let me just, for a few minutes, let me introduce the topic to you, digital rights in Saudi Arabia. You know, there is no such a thing that we could say about Saudi Arabia when it's about the free access to the internet. People are deprived from their natural human and civil rights, including, of course, digital rights. And we know a lot of cases of people who are in prison just because of a tweet or a post on Facebook. And then we have another angle of this topic, which is this ongoing cooperation between Western companies and oppressive governments, such as the Saudi government, about surveillance. And that is really a very important topic, and we are trying to address it. In recent years, we together with Access Now and other organizations, Article 19, Al-Qasd for Human Rights in Saudi Arabia, we tried really to address this cooperation between Western companies and oppressive governments. For example, thousands of websites are blocked in Saudi Arabia due to this cooperation. For example, NetSweeper in Canada, a firm that provided Saudi Arabia and Emirates with the hard and software equipment to block thousands of websites, including our website. So we are really here to discuss such a very important topic that is affecting the lives of many online activists and also ordinary citizens who have every right to access the internet. So I stop here to hand over to my colleague Arij Al-Sadhan, who, as I said, is going to talk about human rights in Saudi Arabia in general, but in particular digital rights. Ms. Arij, please.
Thank you so much for the introduction, and also thank you so much for hosting this event and for having me, and for everyone who's joining. My name is Arij, and I'm the sister of Abdulrahman Sadhan, a humanitarian aid worker My brother Abdurrahman been detained from his office at the Red Crescent in 2018, March 12th. And since then, he was denied any communication with his family. He was denied all basic human rights, such as, having access to lawyers. During all of that time, now 2 years and a half, he was allowed only one call, which lasted only 1 minute. And that was more than 7 months ago, and we haven't heard from him again. So he is still under enforced disappearance. During all of that time, we've heard different reports of torture, some disturbing reports of mistreatment, verbal abuse, physical abuse, threats of murder, physical torture, including electric shocks, beating, and so forth. We've all heard these over and over from even other detainees. Unfortunately, this is becoming a systematic practice in the kingdom, including enforced disappearance. And actually, there is more increased cases of enforced disappearance now. It's becoming more of a common and outspoken practice, although it violates the Saudi's agreements with international human rights and its own agreements, its own laws. Saudi laws actually prohibits enforced disappearance and prohibits detaining people without a warrant, and depriving them from any communication with their families or even access to lawyers. So there's a violation of on all different levels with international human rights and with the Saudi laws itself. And this have increased in the past 2 years, unfortunately. My brother obviously is not the only one. When my brother was detained, it was during a wave of arrests that targeted different human rights activists, different online commentators, different critics, and different journalists as well. During early 2018 and also late 2017, when the major wave of arrests started, just before that, there was a threat that was posted online by a top advisor, Saud al-Qahtani, threatening that the government is gonna go after Twitter accounts, anonymous Twitter accounts, and online anonymous critics and commentators. And just few months later, different people started disappearing. Different people started, being detained, and obviously that was not just by coincidence. Later, a year almost after that, there was all these news about the Twitter spies that were recruited by Saudi Arabia and was backed by the government. Obviously, using foreign tools, using specifically American companies to spy and leak information of users, putting their lives in danger and violating international laws. The Twitter spies weren't the only one that was, the only way that was used to target people and target specifically freedom of speech. There's also spy tools, such as there was a spy system that was bought from NSO group, and was used for the same reason, to target dissidents and to target journalists and different human rights activists. That included, of course, the famous case of journalist Jamal Khashoggi, who ended up being murdered as a result of that. And also there are different human rights organizations were targeted, such as Cause for Human Rights, and also Amnesty International, a staffer, was targeted the same way. And also different journalists, not only Saudi journalists, but also international journalists. One of the cases that were a victim of the online Twitter spies, Saudi Twitter spies, was journalist Turki Al-Jasser. He was detained at around the same time as my brother and was disappeared in the same very similar conditions to my brother. There was reports of torture and severe abuse. His life was endangered. And also international journalists were attacked. Obviously, we all know the case of journalist Jamal Khashoggi, who was a journalist for the Washington Post. The CEO of Washington Post was targeted as well, the same, using the same tools, and also another journalist from the New York Times. So obviously, the amount of damage and the amount of effect of this is not only on Saudi citizens, but also internationally. So this is posing a serious risk and danger to freedom of speech internationally and to people's safety and freedoms, including people's lives, of course. So seriously, this is this is really dangerous. This is really scary. We are still under these threats. No one is safe right now. And that's why we need to look seriously at these problems. Social media tools were invented originally to promote freedom of speech, to help people to stay open and connected. But unfortunately, there are bad actors and governments who are misusing these tools to attack people, to attack freedom of speech, and to threaten people's lives. So that's the reason why we need to speak about these issues and to find ways to help reduce or stop these abuses, and also impose systems and tools for punishment for bad actors who are misusing these tools to threaten people's lives. So that's basically overall. It's a serious topic. It has to be addressed. There isn't much attention to it. And although we have the cases in San Francisco against the Twitter hacking or the leaks of using Twitter spies from a foreign government to target 6,000 accounts so far we've heard in the news. And from these 6,000 accounts, we only knew few people who've been affected as a result of this, severely affected. One of them is my brother, forced disappearance and torture and deprived from any, legal or human rights. Turki Al-Jasser is another case. There are a few other accounts that have been also revealed, but we don't know what their conditions or what exactly their situation, and possibly there are other hundreds who are facing the same fate as a result of this spying and hacking. So hopefully today's discussion can help us to reach solutions, or at least open the discussion to be discussed and to be increase awareness about these issues, and hopefully find better solutions to protect people's freedoms and to protect people's lives, and as well of course digital rights especially in the Middle East region, and specifically in Saudi Arabia, because the level of violations against people's freedoms, threatening their lives and reaching to the point of murder, this is really, really concerning, and it has to be addressed internationally, not just only locally. Thank you. I think you're muted.
Thank you very much, Arid. Mr. Khalid.
1 minute. 1 minute, Abdulaziz. I think you hear me now. Is that correct?
Yep.
So really, thank you, Ms. Arid, for touching upon too many important cases in Saudi Arabia. When we talk about internet activists, your brother Abdurrahman and Sathan, arrested on the 12th of March 2018, he didn't get any visit. He only managed to make a 1-minute call on the 12th of February 2020. So this is just a reflection of how authorities in Saudi Arabia are treating innocent citizens, including activists. And then we know the brutality in which they killed Khashoggi. So really we are facing a government that is ready to do all kinds of abuses. And as you said, we need solutions, we need actions. So I hand over to Mr. Abdulaziz to talk about what he thinks will be a better solution for us to work together to address all these massive violations. Abdulaziz, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Khaled, and my thanks for everybody who is here, the speakers and the audience, a lot of very distinguished people. Today I'm going to talk about initiative that aims to help Saudi people to access internet safely. So we are acting to overcome a couple of challenges that a Saudi activist would face if he's trying to use the internet to express himself. The initiative goes through, if we go to the next slide, sorry, it's disconnected, so I will have to ask my friend here to help me. Thank you. So we believe this could be done through the companies that are doing business in Saudi Arabia. Companies such as Google and Facebook and Twitter are providing the service of the internet in Saudi Arabia. So if a company tries to take an initiative solo or alone, they will face punishment or fire back from the Saudi government as banning from accessing the Saudi market, which is an important market and which would make the company lose a good thing that it is doing by giving Saudi people a way to access each other. So the only way to fight this is through a united front between companies that can act together to solve this problem. I will take you through my presentation through a couple of examples how our companies are suffering from this problem and are announcing it, and how there is in the history companies have worked together to overcome situations like this. So if we can go to the next slide, please. This is an example from a Facebook report. This is in Facebook official page, and it's from the newsroom. It's mentioning Saudi Arabia by name and given an example in the same report about a picture that have Mohammed bin Salman, the most powerful man in Saudi Arabia, in their official report. In this case, Facebook is doing what's right legally and ethically, but Saudi Arabia regimes find this as an offensive or as a hostile move. So if we go to the next case, which Arid mentioned, and this is an employee of Twitter. As you can see, he is wanted by the FBI for spying in Saudi Arabia. This really hits Twitter credibility. Twitter doesn't want to go around with cases from the FBI about people who are arrested through using Twitter, like Abdurrahman Asadhan, Arij's brother. He used to write with the alias name, so he put his opinions not under a public name, and he was caught because of the phone number that he gave to Twitter to activate his account. So if you can go to the next slide, we are talking about an example in 1999. The technology companies have stood up to the Chinese government in a similar technique. And actually, the Chinese government, in that case, have to accept the conditions of the code of the international companies. Now, if we go to the next slide, I think there's a need for companies to apply technologies that can allow individuals living under this kind of regimes to be able to use the internet without being tracing. We are talking about some simple solutions like allowing Saudis to get VPN with no credit card, or sign up in Twitter with no phone number that is connected to Saudi Arabia. The idea is that the social media companies deal with the security of information, with the trust and safety, with a standard measure. So they deal the information for an Irish citizen or an American citizen the same way they deal with the Saudi citizen. But the problem is this regime, and it's an example, it's an extreme example for a regime who have a lot of power and money to play with the technology and act as a bad actor with no legal consequences. And that's sadly the situation in absolute monarchy. So companies have to give more encryption to information that is connected to situation like this. So now we're talking about Saudi Arabia, and restrict the access to information. So in the case of Twitter, when you read the case, what happened? Your man went into databases and get phone numbers of users who are in Saudi Arabia, and then Twitter was late to notify the people that there was a breach. Now, I'm sure that Twitter standards, when it comes to countries like normal countries, it would be good enough. But in the cases of countries that have a bigger problem, then we have to deal with it with in a different way. Now, if we go to the next slide, so what we are talking about is trying to put an advocacy effort that make the companies responsible about taking this effort that is based on knowledge of the problem, to put in place tools and guides. So we need guides for Saudi people, updated, trusted guides, how they can use the existence tools with the most security possible. And also we need more features and tools that help them so they can overcome the Saudi influence. Now, if we go to the next slide, so we are talking about an industry-wide code of conduct that gives the companies the leverage when they speak with the Saudi government. They can not negotiate as a company trying only to uphold human rights, but supported by laws from the country. So and a united front. So the Saudis will lose a lot of leverage when it's come to negotiation with these companies, and we have to be aware that the Saudi government is really reliant on these technologies between Microsoft and Google, YouTube, and other technology companies. The Saudi government can't ban them all. So if you go to the next slide, the government and legislative body should encourage internet companies to develop this industry-wide code of conduct. And we can see that done in the case of the oil companies. The American government have sponsored a code of conduct, and that was agreed on amongst all the big oil companies. So if we are talking about companies who are really old in the industry, I think the social media companies will be more able to act with some thing like that, especially that their philosophy is built on freedom of speech. So if we go to the next slide, here we are talking about the freedom of speech, and the internet is a great tool that can help citizens in Saudi Arabia and other places to express themselves. So the Article 19 really, and Saudi Arabia have signed into the International Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that give the companies the leverage legally and morally to understand that this is something that Saudi Arabia have agreed on. So we are just talking about technicals and how to apply them. If we go to the next slide, please. And I'm sorry, I'm saying the next slide every time, but it's not connected. So companies like Facebook, Twitter, and Microsoft have enormous potential to make the internet and the social media more accessible and safe in Saudi Arabia. As a Saudi activist, sometimes it is very complicated to ask that to make change that have to come from the Saudi government, because at the bottom line, they don't want to solve the problems. But in this case, we are talking about companies that are in their interest financially and in their interest, maybe legally, and because they could be exposed to financial penalties or lawsuits from people who are affected by the not putting the full practices that they can put to make this as hard as possible, and to make this users who trusted these companies as safe as possible. So I will end with this. It's a question. I don't think the companies should think how to integrate themselves with the Saudi regime so they can sail over there. I think the question should be, how can we support free expression so in the long run, everyone has free access to the products that we sell? This is the motive. I think that companies should, if we can eliminate, we will find a response from these companies. What I'm saying is, supporting regimes like Saudi Arabia will just corrupt the example or the added value that companies like this bring. So it's not a choice of short-term profit, but it will destroy you in the long term. So it's better for you to be aware that you have to be true to your goals. You have to be true to your purpose as a company. And that's how you are making money as a company. So that's what stockholders expect from you to perform. If you do otherwise with Saudi Arabia, there is way to make you aware of that. Now, this should come from the companies because it's for their own good. But we have the UN as an entity that can help investigate bad practices and publicly shame these companies. We have the employees of these companies, and we've seen when in Twitter, when Black Lives Matter and the tweets of President Trump, that for example in Facebook, Mark have to speak to the employees of Facebook, so the making employees more aware of what's happening. And the last thing is the legislative bodies, where legislative bodies should make laws that make companies responsible, have more responsibility. So a manager working in a social media company, know if he crossed this line, he's legally crossing the legal line. So I hope this presentation got your attention to a potential initiative that can really put in the hand of activists a tool that helps them in the short term by giving them updated, trusted guides, and in the long terms by building a united front for this issue. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much, Mr. Abdulaziz Al-Muayyad. Thank you for giving us solutions. And I agree with you that we need to talk to big companies such as Twitter, Facebook, and others, Google, as they are really applying the highest standards when it's about the human rights in their home countries. And when they come to our countries, they are working directly with oppressive governments. As to civil society, they are ignoring our needs, and also they are not ready to cooperate with us. Often they are trying to even put restrictions on some of our accounts. So we need to talk to them, we need to work with them, and we need to ask them also to apply the same highest standards that they have in their home countries to our countries. And I think we could really work together in this direction. Without any ado, I move to my colleague, Ms. Salwa Al-Ghazwani, who is going to talk about trends in relation to digital rights violations in the MENA region and the work of Article 19. Salwa, it is yours.
Thank you very much, Khaled. Thank you for hosting this very important event, and thank you all for all the speakers. I think with the COVID-19 pandemic, and as we are moving for everything to be online, suggesting this team is very, very important. It is very important, of course, online activism is very important in our region, but also within this context of COVID-19 COVID-19 pandemic, it becomes more important. So I was requested to speak about the trends in the MENA region, and I will focus a little bit on the legal trend, because what we have seen, and which is common for the countries in the MENA region, from the North Africa to the Middle East to the Gulf countries, is this willingness from the governments to amend old laws or adopt new laws, or even take administrative decisions or general authorities just to restrict more and more freedom of expression online. And this has been happening within the context of COVID-19. We have seen many countries adopting new laws with the excuse to, for example, counter fake news. But what we have seen that the provisions that these laws or amendments is providing unproportional sanctions that can reach 2 or 3 years prison. We have seen also that the good faith or the bad intention, the bad faith is not taken into consideration. We have seen, for example, that the administrative decisions that have been issued in UAE in March or maybe April 2020, so to counter fake news around COVID-19, so it devotes that any news that it is not coming from official sources like the Ministry of Health is considered fake news, and the sanctions are very high. It is a big fine. And also in Egypt, it is the same. So the sanction can reach for publishing a fake news online can reach 2 years prison. We have seen that also in Morocco, in Algeria. So in Morocco, they are copying the French experience to adopt a law that regulates fake news. That regulates social media. But what has happened is they are only copying the penal part of this draft law, and they are not, for example, taking any. So the draft law is not providing, for example, any positive measures like media literacy. So they are only imposing fines and big sanctions to anyone using social media to express themselves without also taking into consideration the bad faith, which is, or the bad intention, which is a strong element that the government should confirm or should prove to restrict freedom of expression online. Because if not, so legitimate and lawful critiques, mainly targeting governments or policies, government policies or government practices, will be restricted. Towards Article 19, thanks to the two previous speakers, because they have mentioned a good testimony that with strong elements that happening in Saudi Arabia, and also the next speaker proposing some ways how we can maybe open up the discussion and hold governments in the MENA region to be accountable and to respect their international commitments. So what I would like to speak on what Article 19 is doing, of course, in partnership with many organizations working, national, regional, and also international organizations working in the MENA region. So we are following all these legislative initiatives, these bad legislative initiatives, to counter them through advocacy, joint advocacy. We are providing legal analysis to make clear what are the problems of these legislative initiatives and how the government should revise them. In Tunisia, we were able to, for example, counter this legislative initiative in March, which aims to counter fake news online and protect public figures from any criticism online. So the owner of this legislative has publicly declared that he will not go ahead, but the bad news that this legislation or this draft law is still in front of the parliament in Tunisia and can be discussed again. So we have the 46 organizations that signed this public statement calling the Tunisian government, the Tunisian parliament, to avoid adopting this problematic draft law has achieved the result, but the bad news that this legislation, as I said, still in front of the Tunisian parliament. In Algeria, also they have proposed amendment which they were unfortunately adopted by the Algerian government, and these amendments to the penal code to counter fake news online are being used. And we know that the famous independent Algerian journalist Khaled Edrani is now facing 3 years or 4 years imprisonment because of a tweet about what is happening in Algeria in terms of protests. So this journalist didn't do anything else than doing his job as an independent journalist and covering what is happening and going on in his country. But he is now facing 3 or 4 years of imprisonment. So Article 19 is doing legal analysis and to counter, and also simplified statements to raise awareness, to counter, to work with civil society organizations locally and counter these problematic legislations. We are also targeting digital companies through a strategic global campaign called Missing Voices. Through this campaign, we are speaking to Facebook, Twitter, Google, and others on how they can change their policies and terms of conditions, and how they can respect their commitments towards the human rights defenders and activists who are expressing themselves, and they are facing tracking online. They are facing sanctions that can reach to forced disappearance in the MENA region. So through this campaign, we are working with many organizations in the MENA region to raise the awareness of citizens and of those who are expressing themselves online, but also to make the digital campaigns respect their commitments and hold to their commitments. We are also doing trainings on digital security for human rights defenders and journalists within the coronavirus context, but also before that. We are submitting statements and communications to the international mechanisms, mainly the UN mechanisms, also about some cases when we feel that UN mechanisms can do pressure on the governments to make them reactive to what they are doing in terms of infringing freedom of expression online. So yes, unfortunately, so with maybe different degrees and levels, but it is common for the MENA region that freedom of expression online is threatened, and within the context of the COVID-19, it becomes more and more restrictive to people to express themselves, and we need maybe to act together to in terms of raising awareness, in terms of suggesting solutions, and of course continuing the advocacy at the local, regional, and international level. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Salwa Al-Ghazwani. Thank you for talking about overall review of legislations across the MENA region that are really designed to put more restrictions on freedom of expression on the internet. And also thank you for talking about the important work of Article 19. Now, without any ado, I move to my colleague, Ms. Marwa Fatafta, who is going to talk about another important kind of topic, surveillance across the MENA region and the work of Access Now. Yes, Marwa, it's yours.
Thank you so much, Khalid, and so much also for the Saudi Diaspora Party and others for organizing this important session. So as Khalid mentioned, I represent Access Now as the policy manager for the Middle East and North Africa. Access Now is a global organization with the mission to defend and extend the digital rights of users at risk around the globe. And we have a regional office in Tunisia where we focus on the MENA region. I will talk about surveillance in Saudi Arabia as well as in the wider MENA regions and its implication on human rights, particularly the right to freedom of expression and the right to peaceful assembly and association. And touching on what Arij and Abdulaziz had already mentioned, I think the latest repression in Saudi Arabia that started with the Crown Prince coming into power and consolidating that power in 2017, Saudi Arabia has become the example of what digital authoritarianism is. So the government is weaponizing social media and online spaces to surveil, harass, and prosecute individuals for their online activities and for exercising their right to freedom of expression and opinion. This includes monitoring of social media and digital spaces. As Arij mentioned, Saudi officials have been very open and public on social media, particularly on Twitter. I think that's the most used platform in Saudi Arabia to target and harass dissidents openly. So in 2017, one of the top advisors, Saud al-Qahtani, he mentioned or started a hashtag called the Blacklist, calling on Saudi Twitter users to identify online users that the government should target and harass. He also alluded, as Arij mentioned in a separate tweet, that using pseudonyms will not protect users as they will be identified, and he didn't elaborate on what mechanisms the government is using to identify online users. I think it's important to note here that pseudonyms and encryption and other tools of anonymity and privacy are crucial for online internet users to exercise their right to free speech and opinion, especially in a repressive context like Saudi Arabia. And the attempt of the Saudi authorities to silence online critics went far into bribing Twitter employees, namely Twitter's head of Middle East partnership in San Francisco, and another Saudi software engineer who was employed at Twitter at the time. And both of them, they had access to Twitter's databases or the internal system, and they handed over emails, phone numbers, IP addresses of online Saudi dissidents. And according to media reports, they passed the private information of about 6,000 Twitter users to Crown Prince or to the Saudi authorities. There's also, in addition to social media monitoring and trying to extract information or private information of online users, there's evidence that Saudi Arabia has deployed surveillance technologies to target activists, political dissidents living outside of Saudi Arabia. So in 2018, Citizen Lab, which is an academic research center based in Canada, they published a report that a Saudi activist, Omar Abdulaziz, was also based in Quebec or in Canada. They concluded with full confidence that his cell phone was targeted by a spyware called Pegasus, which is manufactured and sold by an Israeli surveillance tech firm, the NSO Group. The spyware allows the customer, in this case, for example, the Saudi authorities, to have full access to the target's chats, communications, emails, photos, contacts, etc. It can also turn on the camera and the microphone of the cell phone to eavesdrop on the person's whereabouts and conversations, and to track the movement of the target. This spyware was, of course, used to hack into the cell phone of the brutally murdered Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi. and 2 other Saudi activists. One is based in the UK, and another Saudi comedian, Ghanem al-Manasir. And according to Citizen Lab, and as Arij mentioned, an Amnesty International staffer was also targeted, and a New York Times journalist were the recipient of this Pegasus spyware. Of course, this is the use of this particular spyware is not only restricted to Saudi Arabia. The most famous example, or I believe even the first report about the use of such technology was used against or to surveil the human rights defender in the UAE, Ahmed Mansour, who was detained in 2017 for his activity on social media and for advocating for human rights in the UAE. He was sentenced to 10 years in prison. Again, Ahmed Mansour was surveilled for about a year using the same technology. And following the murder of Khashoggi, it brought a lot of international attention to the NSO selling its spyware to authoritarian governments. And as a result, the company announced in September 2019 that they have a new human rights policy which pledges to identify, prevent, and mitigate human rights impact related to the use of its surveillance products. Of course, despite this public pledge and the PR around it, there's very little evidence that such policy has been effective in stopping or mitigating the use of such technologies to target human rights defenders and activists by authoritarian and oppressive regimes. The recent episode of which is the targeted surveillance of a Moroccan activist and journalist, Omar Radi. According to a report by Amnesty International, Omar Radi was targeted 3 days before the NSO group announced its human rights policy. And despite Amnesty International providing further evidence earlier in 2019 that the NSO spyware has been used by the Moroccan government to surveil pro-democracy activists. So moving on from the use of targeted and mass surveillance into Saudi Arabia, going into the wider region, targeted surveillance is, of course, just only one part of the picture. As I mentioned, in the case of Saudi Arabia, many governments in the region monitor social media to see what people are doing and saying online, and afterwards prosecuting them using repressive legislations that Salwa mentioned for expressing themselves and sharing opinions on social media. Other uses of surveillance technologies include, of course, mass surveillance, so surveilling at a larger scale and not necessarily targeting certain individuals like journalists and human rights defenders and activists. And one of those technologies is the use of facial recognition, which is not often talked about in our region, but I believe it is definitely worth further investigation. So, for example, in Dubai, it was announced that the police will start rolling out an artificial intelligence-powered facial recognition technologies called Ayun, which means eyes in Arabic, and the program will allow the police to record and analyze people's faces, movements, voices, cars, etc., which in a repressive context like the UAE, it means the full surveillance and control over not only what people are doing online, but also what are they doing offline in their daily life by using this high-tech or new technologies. Another form of mass surveillance that was used in the UAE was the introduction of a messaging app called TikTok. As you know, in the UAE and many other Gulf states, some messaging apps such as Skype or WhatsApp, they're banned, and the governments try, in the particular case of the UAE, the government tries to push individuals or internet users to use only allowed platforms that the government allow. In this case, there are two messaging apps in the UAE, and one of them is TikTok, which later last year, I think an investigation by the New York Times found that the app is passing all the information of users, their communications, their photos, their appointments, and whatever information that the app can get from the cell phones when the users download it on their phones, passing all of that information to the Emirati intelligence agencies, meaning that, again, the government is able to spy on people's communications, private communications. Now, also in the context of the global pandemic, as Salwa mentioned, governments are gearing up to further control online spaces as more and more people are using the internet for education, for health, for work, and for private communications. In many countries in the region, we've seen governments have deployed contact tracing apps. These are apps that should, on face value, they have the purpose of notifying users when they have been in the close proximity of a COVID-19 patient or an infection case. But research until this point showed that these applications have zero or have no utility for public health. Of course, in many countries, or in some countries in the region, such as Bahrain, the use of the app is mandatory, so you have to download this app. And unfortunately, in many of those apps, there are vulnerabilities that could lead to the breach of people's personal data. There was also another investigation by Amnesty International that found a vulnerability in the Qatari app, for example, which means the personal data of millions of users in Qatar could be easily hacked by bad actors. And so I think the commercial surveillance, as you said, Khalid, is a systematic and a global problem, and its impact on human rights exacerbate in authoritarian contexts such as our region, the MENA region. And that's, of course, for a number of reasons, one of which is that there is no transparency whatsoever about the purchase and the procurement of these technologies. And the security apparatuses in many of countries in the region, they operate in full secrecy, without accountability and without oversight. And usually these agencies are the main repressive tools and the main human rights violators in the region, especially when it comes to freedom of expression and also the right to privacy. In Saudi Arabia, for example, one of the steps that the Crown Prince had took to consolidate more power was to restructure the security system to basically bring all of the security agencies under his direct control and supervision, meaning that he is able to direct the targeting of human rights defenders, of activists, of journalists, or anyone who has an opinion that is different from the Saudi state. The second problem where this use of such surveillance technologies becomes especially problematic in our region is that there are no robust legislations or regulations that protect people's right to privacy, even though many of the governments in the region are signatories to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. The right to privacy is enshrined in many of the constitutions in the region. However, when it comes to legislations and regulations that should protect people's data, that should protect people's privacy, in many countries these legislations are missing, or when they exist, such as in the case of Tunisia or Morocco, they are inadequate. They're old and they don't fit the risks emerging from the use of new technologies. And the third issue here, also in the region, is that there is no access to remedy. So people who have been targets for government surveillance people who have been arrested, have been forcibly disappeared, people have been jailed. They don't have any access to effective remedy. I mean, not to the violation of their right to privacy, obviously, and many other violations of their human rights. So it's been 4 years since it was first revealed that Ahmed Mansour is being targeted using this, now what we know is called Pegasus, manufactured by the NSO group. Also, after Jamal Khashoggi's murder, there have been a lot of international criticism and attention about how these private companies are selling their spyware technologies to governments and dictatorships without a shred of accountability. The European Parliament, for example, right after Khashoggi's murder, adopted a resolution calling on the Saudi government to immediately and unconditionally release human rights defenders and activists, and also to implement a wide EU or an EU-wide ban on the export of surveillance systems, among any other, among other restrictions, such as freezing assets of Saudi officials and visa bans, etc. However, despite these efforts, there has been very little done on holding the Saudi regime accountable for its human rights violations. And as evidenced by the murder of Khashoggi and the arrest of Ahmed Mansour and many, many other cases in the region, targeted as well as mass surveillance has serious human rights violations. We, as Access Now, published in July a report on the right to peaceful assembly and association, and how unlawful surveillance affect that right, where users feel that they're being watched, and it has a chilling effect on their freedom of expression, and also on their ability to organize and to mobilize online. So, as I said, I mean, this is a global problem, and the surveillance has thrived because, first of all, there are weak controls on technology transfers and exports, especially to repressive regimes and dictatorships. Second, that the market is really is operating in full secrecy. What the examples that I have mentioned and what we really know is the result of civil society organizations' work and investigative reporting by independent media. And so what we know is really only the tip of the iceberg. But what we know in terms of its implications on people's human rights, I think is enough for us to advocate for a serious overhaul of the global system when it comes to exporting surveillance technologies, especially to repressive governments, such as in the case of our region. The problem is so serious, so there are many, many companies popping up like mushrooms everywhere around many corners in the world, selling these surveillance technologies without any transparency, without any accountability, without any sort of regulation. And it has become so serious that the UN, or the former UN Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Expression and Opinion, David Kay, he called for an immediate moratorium on the global sale and transfer of the private surveillance technologies, especially that previous calls for tighter controls around surveillance exports and restrictions, they basically did not work. And so we at Access Now are advocating for an urgent global reform and a comprehensive overhaul of regulations for the surveillance industry. And we need to strengthen international norms against state hacking to ensure accountability and transparency under specific human rights respecting rules. So imposing a moratorium is number one, is very important, but that's the first step. Governments, private companies, and international bodies such as the UN, they have the mandate of the task to address these systematic failures around surveillance, exports, etc. and try to address these deficiencies in regulations by having a more robust strategy around how these technologies are being manufactured and how they are being exported to repressive regimes, which of course leads to, as we have already discussed, extrajudicial killing, as in the case of Jamal Khashoggi, detention and arrests, or even forced disappearance, torture, and so on. And so as Access Now, we have been working on a number of fronts, on advocating on these specific cases, on strategic litigation, among other venues where we can push for these reforms. In the meantime, of course, we provide support to activists and human rights defenders and other civil society organizations that are under attack through our helpline, digital security team, who provide digital security support to affected users who suspect that they are being surveilled or under attack by their governments.
Thank you so much, Ms. Marwa, for this really valuable presentation about what's going on in our region, in the MENA region, including Saudi Arabia. So we are facing the chronic problems, surveillance, equipment, cooperation between Western companies and oppressive governments, such as, you have SNO, it has branches in UK, and then you have NetSweeper, hacking team, and others. They are supporting oppressive governments, despite, as you mentioned, a lot of directives, such as the EU directives. And then you talk about applications such as facial recognition and location tracking applications, the TikTok, all that are used to monitor online activisms. And many of our colleagues, as you mentioned, Ahmed Mansour, for example, in prison due to this cooperation. Ahmed Mansour is serving 10 years just because of tweets, and after the authorities, United Arab Emirates, managed to hack into his various accounts. So I stop here to invite you if you have any questions, to present them to our distinguished speakers. We are here to address all the questions. I hope that we unmute whoever has a question here. So time for questions. Thank you.
If you allow me, Mr. Khalid, I just have a comeback or just some points I want to highlight from my.
Yes, of course. Go ahead. Of course, so, if you have some comments, you are free to say them.
First of all, I want to highlight the point that my colleague said about Saudi Arabia is an extreme example. That's true. Saudi Arabia, because of the financial power of the Saudi government and because of the absolute monarchy legal system, how it works, we got the most extreme example in Saudi Arabia. So in the case of Saudi Arabia, it can be used as a case study for the efforts to be built on, because you have the most extreme example, then you can build on it. Not only this, the restrictions have to be different. When you said, Mr. Khalid, that companies apply the highest standards of human rights in their own countries, the problem is, if you even apply the same equal amount of rights, there will be a problem in Saudi Arabia. So if a legal system come to you and give you a subpoena for some information, a respected government, it would be a different argue than a government that have history of jailing human rights activists. So the case of Saudi Arabia is different than other cases. For example, here in this, we have 10 Saudi activists, 11. The public Saudi dissidents or activists are hundreds around the world. I work in the Saudi diaspora convention. We make it yearly, and Jamal Khashoggi was part of it. So I know the numbers, like 100 Saudi activists. In this meeting, 10% of us are over here. It's a very historical and unique situation where these 10 people have more legitimacy than Mohammed bin Salman, who doesn't have one vote. 10 free votes speak the mind and the soul of the Saudi people more than the Saudi government. So what I want to say, the efforts that was done, Salwa mentioned some of them, and Access Now also have a lot of efforts. They are not enough, or they lack a certain point. This point is the unique situation of Saudi Arabia. So we have to make a project that answer the question. I got a lot of activists. I was working in the B Army project that was started by Jamal Khashoggi also. And people ask us, what's the safest way to access the internet? I can't answer that question with confidence. I send them to a defender, frontline defenders guideline, which a lot of the information in it have not updated near of it. Now we're talking about cybersecurity with the Saudi regime, and we're facing that with a guideline or with an instruction that is not even updated for a couple of years. So thinking about Saudi Arabia is an important critical point. A colleague of mine starting a project, a new project, I was very sad when he said, now there is no spies at Twitter, because I know as a fact, he can't know that. So when you tell Saudi people it's safe to put your numbers in Twitter because there's no spies, I don't feel confident on that, because you can't know, you really can't know. But I know there is another way that we can tell Twitter that the number of the Saudis should have a different kind of encryption. So you can't access them normally. And if you access them straight away, it goes to different employees or whatever. So there is a way to fight it. But personally, I left, I work in a project in one of the biggest social media companies in the world. I lived my whole life. I used to have a publishing house in Saudi Arabia. When I became a Saudi activist, I became a dissident, exile, I live in exile. But Arij is at hand, and they really can't feel the pain that you feel, Arij, when your brother is in jail. Arij's brother and other Saudi activists are inside of Saudi Arabia, and they can't do this role. If they speak to international companies or NGOs, they go to jail for that. So we have the role, us, and ask solidarity from you to build on that and think the speciality and the unique case in Saudi Arabia, and how can solving it help the rest of the world. I will go very fast. When social media companies come, they created a different dynamic in the Saudi dialogue. So we have a hashtag that's called الراتب ما يكفي الحاجة. The salary is not enough. And we find a lot of public figures, everybody was participating before the government come down in it. So it is a tool that can help us in countries that have no other tool, no unions, no organization, no elections, no free journalists. Social media is our only hope. When I waste my life, not waste my life, but when I put my life to Saudi activism, I want to use it the best use. And I think making internet easy to access is the best way. And just the last point, when we come to the point of the surveillance, I think, and I read in this subject, just its opinion, that the way to fight surveillance is not by stopping surveillance companies, because even hackers at a certain level can do the techniques, but it's mass big data and mass access to anonymous, because the active users in Saudi Arabia or the activists, they are the grassroots, they are the people. So the trick is not to let the Saudi people know who's coming to them. Just give the people the freedom, and a football lover or a fashionist wouldn't use these techniques, but an activist would use it. And an activist is born every day in Saudi Arabia and nobody knows about him. And they go to jail because not everybody have a brave sister like Arij who fight for her brother. There is a lot in jail, and when we work in B Army, we heard names that go in jail just for simple activism. We have to give mass access to this, and only people who can do this is the social media companies. And thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Abdul Aziz. The reality is still the big companies, they have to apply human rights standards. They have to speak with civil society organizations. They have to really cooperate with the few human rights organizations when it's about the protection of internet access. Having an oppressive government is not an excuse for big companies not to work with us. And only to focus on their ties with governments. With that, I will just open the floor for questions. If you have a question, just raise it now. It is the proper time for that. Before I will hand over again to our other panelists for their comments. Questions, please. Is there any question? You are free to talk. Really, we could unmute you and talk. Any question?
I have a question.
Yes, please go ahead.
So we talked a lot about privacy and large. Okay, so we talked a lot about privacy and large-scale change that that's undoubtedly needed. But what can we do for, like, as activists in the free world? What can we do for activists on the ground in terms of digital security in the more immediate future, I guess? Are there perhaps software solutions that some of us may be able to provide? And is there like perhaps points of advice that or things that could be said to people who are watching and are in that position right now?
Thank you so much for your question, and I will hand over to Arij and then Salwa and then Marwa to address this. It is about digital security, how we could protect internet activists in terms of their security. Do we have manuals, tools? So we start with Arij. You are an internet activist. We see you on Twitter and other places. So what is your advice to people who are in the field in Saudi Arabia and other countries that have totalitarian governments? Yes, Arij.
Yeah, so in terms of online security, unfortunately, there is no special tools that can help you protect your safety. So if you're an activist, the first thing you have to assume that, you know, there is possibility that your information is going to leak at some point, or you're going to be targeted. In my case, I live in the United States in California, so I know that my U.S. government is protecting freedom of speech, and I've spoken openly with them about the threats that I'm facing as I advocate for my brother and for human rights. For people who are living in dictatorship countries, all I can say, the best policy to protect yourself is to always delete and never leave any personal information on your devices. Whatever devices you're using, it should not be your personal devices. I guess this is the safest way to do it, is never leave any traces, never leave, you know, your personal information you know, either online or on your device, and avoid the practice of like using backup or like saving, you know, critical information that can link to your personal data. This is I guess the best advice I can give in terms of, especially for countries, for people who live in oppressive countries, where they can face serious consequences for their freedom of expression or freedom of speech, or just simply expressing themselves. We know that doesn't only apply to activists, also applies to simply people, you know, could be criticizing maybe not having jobs, for example, someone who's not even an activist, just complaining that, you know, the taxes, for example, the taxes in Saudi Arabia all of a sudden jumped from 5 to 15, and people were struggling. People could be complaining about not finding jobs. They graduated with high degrees, but they're struggling for years not finding jobs, and we see that all the time online. And occasionally we hear of people being detained for simply just one complaint or one tweet. So the threat is not only on activists, on active activists, but also on almost everyone who dare to complain about even the simplest rights. So protecting yourself is very important, and you know, just make it a practice that you're not keeping personal or sensitive data online or on your devices, and avoid the practice of, you know, using backup if you're using that device for sort of activism, and make sure, you know, you always delete, even if you're posting online or whatever, just delete whatever, you know, you're sharing on your device, so you don't end up having to deal with such oppressive practices. I think you're muted, Khalid.
Thank you so much, Arif, for such valuable advices. And we move to Salwa. What are your thoughts about this?
Yes, so we are providing some trainings on digital security, and there are some knowledge and some advices that anyone who is practicing activism online should be aware. So I'm not myself a trainer or an expert, but yeah, we can share materials if you want with you. So yes, so there are some legal aspects and also technical aspects that we should be aware to. We will not be, of course, protected 100%, but at least we are aware what we are assuming as a human rights practicing activism online.
Thank you, Salwa. Marwa, what do you think about that?
I have a question, if you don't mind.
Marwa?
Yeah,
Digital security.
Yeah, I mean, on digital security, I'm not a digital security expert, and I think the first advice is to always take into consideration where you are, and because that pretty much influences the threats that you might face using the internet. And listening to Abdulaziz, I was thinking, you know, maybe indeed there is a need for special resources dedicated to internet users in Saudi Arabia and how they can use the internet safely. I think that's very important. Of course, there are general practices for any user to follow just out of good, you know, digital security practice. One of them, as Arij mentioned, is trying not to do any backups, try to use two-factor authentication, don't use easy passwords. Also, I think it's very important in the Gulf and region in general, but maybe also in Saudi Arabia, when you download applications, read their privacy policies, read what these applications, which data they are collecting, and don't give consent. Don't give consent without understanding how these applications are collecting information that, as in the case of the UAE, might pass this information to intelligence agencies. But again, I just want to highlight the need for Saudi activists in specific. As Access Now, we would be happy to work later down the line in trying and finding out what would be the best practices based on that threat model in Saudi Arabia, how they can use the internet safely.
Thank you, Marwa. And as Salwa mentioned, we have online training and face-to-face training. Hopefully, after we just get out of this crisis of COVID-19. So there are also opportunities to get the training with us, with Article 19, with others. We will have an online digital security training in October. I talked to Abdulaziz about it. So there are opportunities, but then there are some manuals in Arabic. Just go and see Tactical Attack website, and you see a manual, security in a box, and other manuals. They are very simple in Arabic, and you could get good security. But what my colleagues just said to you, there are really valuable advices about deleting any sign, any sensitive information. Be careful. As you see, even if you have a shadow account on Twitter, you are at risk. Abdurrahman Sadhan, he got a shadow account, but got arrested. So you have just to be very careful. Big companies still, they are not cooperating in terms of enhancing the protection of online activists. So we see if there is any other. Abdulaziz, do you have any comment on that, or we move to another question? Yes.
No, I'm good. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Abdulaziz. So we see if there is another question. Is there any question?
Yes, I have a question. Sorry.
Yes, please go ahead. Yes.
Right, so I used to work with Google here in Switzerland, and now they have a lot of applications and AI that's now reading data points. So processing about 1.5 billion data points every day from people's social media accounts, from what you search. So in terms of protecting yourself, I think it's getting harder to protect yourself, even if you delete your stuff or you take stuff out. So I think I would advise, I don't know if you guys are looking into DLT solutions, blockchain solutions that allow for decentralized privacy online. So
yeah, I understand. Really, to be honest with you, I will ask also our distinguished speakers to comment on your question, but we have an IT expert, and if you email me, you have my email. It is available with Abdulaziz and other colleagues. You just email me and I refer you to an IT expert who is working with us. He is really capable of guiding you. As my colleagues said, we are not security experts, but we could refer you to people who could give you the best advice.
I see Remap posting something. It's not really about using Brave browser, but for example, you have a good community activist. Would you guys consider the possibility of making your own browser, your own blockchain private browser that could be used for activism, for spreading information, safe from all the data feeds that are being pulled by companies and multinational corporations?
Yeah. Well, as I told you, I am not in a position to give you an advice on activities on the internet. I prefer to refer you to the IT expert who is working with us. But I leave it for our distinguished speakers if they have comment on this question. Marwa, Salwa, Arij, Abdulaziz. Yes, please go ahead. Yeah.
First, thank you, Shika. It's nice to have Google ex-employees with us here, so that's really valuable. I thank you for being here. The trick in Saudi Arabia, and this might come to a lot of what was said here. An activist is a young 20-year-old young person feeling something that he wants to express. He's not an internet expert. He's not a social media expert. You can't. There is the technology is over there, so we are not asking for applying or researching new technologies. You are totally right. Blockchain and other technologies can give brilliant solutions to this issue, but the problem is you have to make a solution that is easy enough to go to the simple activist, because when you if you talk about privacy settings, the problem is when the Saudis have a front company that make an app, they don't respect the law. They don't respect what they are signing for. So it's a very tricky situation. And asking Arij, it's a hard question, asking the others, because if you answer it wrong, you are putting people in trouble. It's a tricky one. So we have to know that this question should be answered by a bunch of social media, cyber experts sitting and updating and seeing what's the Saudi regime doing and what's the systems over there, and other activists amplifying this and delivering it to the society.
Thank you, Abdulaziz. And I have a comment from Mohammed al-Masqati. He's a well-known digital security expert. He's saying it is a bad idea, I think, to add a Brave browser in the list under fire for a privacy problem recently. So he is concluding by saying it is a bad idea. That's from IT expert Mohammed al-Masqati. Now, I see if there is no any question, I just refer to our distinguished speakers to have their final say, each for 1 minute. If there is no any question. Do we have any other question? It seems we don't. So our speakers, you have 1 minute just to say whatever you think about the future of our work, how we are going to overcome all these problems that we are facing in the MENA region, and in particular in Saudi Arabia. So we start with Arij, your final say. And
yeah, so thank you, Khalid. So the main thing that we need to focus on is to keep speaking about these issues and bringing these issues up to lawmakers, you know, world leaders, human rights organizations. These are critical issues, and we cannot stay quiet about it. Social media companies were founded in the you know, in the West to promote freedom of speech, but unfortunately it's being exploited and misused in the Middle Eastern regions, and specifically in Saudi Arabia. So it's critical that everyone's attention to be brought to how these tools are being used and misused in these countries, and putting people's lives in danger. So I just want to emphasize on that. more attention needs to be
Yeah.
taken.
True.
That's all for me.
Thank you, Arij. I agree with you. More attention, and we are really working on creating a coalition to address surveillance and other chronic problems in cooperation with Access Now, Article 19, Amnesty International, and Al-Qasd for Human Rights and others. This is very important to share resources. I move to Abdulaziz. Your final say in 1 minute, please.
I would like to thank everybody who's here, the guests, the speakers, and everybody who was here, who's here.
Yes.
We are like, this is a big Zoom meeting with a lot of Saudi activists. We have a historical responsibility, and we have a potential to push one of the agendas. In our activism, it's very hard to get to succeed. It's tricky to make the Saudi government change. In this fight, we are working. Let's not call it the fight. In this collaboration, we are working with the social media companies, which we have the right, we have the case, and as if we can get freedom of speech, we can get a lot of things changed in Saudi Arabia.
Thank you, Mr. Abdulaziz. The reality, the success is difficult, but it's coming. That peaceful change is coming, but it will take time. So we move to Salwa. Your final say, please.
For me, I think that we need to work at many different sites to address freedom of expression online and the threats to freedom of expression online in the MENA region. So from targeting governments, digital companies, the general public, human rights defenders, etc. And we need also more joint work and more solidarity across the region.
Yes, solidarity, that's very important. Thank you so much, Salwa. And Marwa, your final say?
Yeah, thank you so much, Khalid. I want to build on what Selwa said. I think solidarity, and for us as civil society organizations, to work together in coalitions and partnerships together with activists on the ground or in diaspora, because clearly the threat in the region and the violations, it's very hard to pressure governments into reform, either by revoking these bad repressive legislations or by adopting new ones that allow and permit freedom of expression, among other human rights. And in this case, it is very important for us as civil society organizations and activists to work together to address these violations and to ensure that internet users, and not only activists, but internet users in general, are able to use the internet freely without the threat of being jailed, killed, murdered, having your family members threatened as well. So thank you so much again for hosting this very important session.
Thank you so much, Marwa. We have to work together. So let me just thank all the attendees who have taken time out to attend this sad event that is focused on digital rights in Saudi Arabia. Let me also to thank our distinguished speakers, Abdulaziz Al-Muayyad, Arij Al-Sadhan, Salwa Al-Ghazwani, and Marwa Fatafa. Thank you so much, all of you. I wish you a very good day. We have to meet again to work together on various fronts. Thank you. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.